Welcome once again to the back porch. We've got a beautiful rainy day out today. The flowers are getting a drink. And I'm getting a drink with my blackberry bubbly seltzer. So we come to the road to Emmaus. It is this strange moment where Jesus is not recognized. So he's not in disguise here, and he's not hiding his face. He's not walking behind the disciples on the road. They just don't recognize him. Now, I think we might be tempted to say something like, well, he's God, so he can supernaturally make himself look different, or put them in a trance so they don't recognize him. But the passage says nothing about that. If you think about this, it's not entirely all that strange, I don't think. He was supposed to be dead, after all. Jesus' teaching ministry could be seen as a long exercise in changing the way people think and see. Not so much giving people new information or sensory data, but he's giving them entirely new eyes, new minds. We come across this important concept of repentance, or literally, to change your mind, your way of thinking. The task Jesus faces in his ministry is much harder than it looks on the surface. He's not, contrary to much popular perception, just teaching a generalized way of being a good person or stringing together a series of pithy aphorisms without a whole lot of organizing principle that add up to something like a generalized abstract idea of love or hope or faith. His task is to give people an entirely new basis for knowing things. So recall the word epistemology, or the study of ways of knowing. We know that we know certain things. The question is, how do we know? When we take a look at epistemology, we are studying the lenses of our glasses, so to speak. Normally we just look through our glasses. So to do what he's doing, Jesus must undermine an entire worldview. It's probably something deeper than worldview. Epistemology is deeper than worldview. Maybe an example of this is the messianic secret. The question is, why does Jesus so often appear to be reluctant to claim out in the open that he is indeed the Messiah? He's here to save. Finally, the moment has arrived when God is acting to redeem Israel. So why not stand up tall on the mountaintop and proclaim his messiahship for all to hear? The reason I'm convinced is because people all over Israel, the great and the small, the high and the low, the in-between, everyone already knows what a Messiah is, and what they know is wrong. The images and associations they have with it are just inadequate. More than inadequate, they're perverse. In retrospect, after his crucifixion, we see that the standard method and expectations for a Messiah are not what Jesus is planning on. So to simply leave people's messianic awareness right where it is and to declare his messiahship out loud would not do anything to change their presuppositions about messiahship, and therefore it wouldn't elevate anybody's chances of receiving him. Using the word Messiah would actually be bad for people's perception. It would create bad faith. In order for Jesus to do messianic works and to be received, he must spend the time and effort dismantling their perceptions and giving them a new one. This is a gradual process, especially when the primary article of messiahship that he's introducing is death, even death on a cross. And let's not pretend that the final pieces fall into place early here for the disciples. This way of knowing comes retrospectively after the cross, the resurrection, and eventually Pentecost. We should view the Emmaus Road here as this critical turning point that restructures the epistemology of his disciples. So everywhere Jesus goes, people have received a way of knowing and expectation that is poisonous, built on the wrong foundation, aimed entirely in the wrong direction. What's worse, the results of this poisoned epistemology have been very effective and polished. It stands up to rational scrutiny. It's a highly sensible way of understanding God in the world, by many measures. So the poisoned mind is able to go on thinking that its thinking is basically on the right track. This whole thing has to be undermined. The job of the prophet is to attack these poisoned presuppositions, and it's not a popular role. So the vision of his death as integral to his messianic calling is rejected by virtually everyone, even his most zealous disciples, when they are confronted with it. Imagine it this way. A person, a young person who's been raised in a closed, windowless room her entire life, and through reading and conversation has encountered secondhand knowledge of the sun in the daytime, but she's never seen the sun. She's never been outside. And when she finally makes it outside, it's nighttime and the moon is in the sky. But because all she has ever known is a closed room, and because she is completely enraptured by the brand new experience of being in the open air and in the natural light, she thinks the night is day, and she thinks the moon is the sun. Okay, next day edit. This anecdote is from an 1879 children's book by George MacDonald. It's called The Day Boy and the Night Girl. And it's a fantastic parable for how people cannot simply come to know a reality that is not their own, except by relating it to previously existing knowledge. The reader takes day and night for granted. The girl cannot, never having seen the outside of her room. So being exposed to the new reality is an exercise in creating a falsehood at first. This is unavoidable. The falsehood, in fact, has some consequences. When daytime really comes, she's unprepared and begins to feel that she's withering and dying under the fierce heat and light of the sun. This is partly a problem of naming things incorrectly, but it's also a problem of the expectation for what is real. The girl in the room experiences a new thing, the outside, but learns it in a way that conforms to her previously existing schema for the world, the room. The association is the only one she's capable of making. In reality, the room exists within the world, as an aspect of it. In her experience, and in the deep structure of her mind, it's the opposite. Her world is the room. The world outside can only be known in reference to the room. For her, reality is confined to the room, and the very synaptic pathways that have developed in her brain only allow her to see it in reverse. It will take time and much experience before she's able to see straight, so to speak. There's no immediate way to impart the fullness of this truth to her. It's this painstaking process of realizing new things and comporting them with the new reality until eventually things flip around and she starts to see that the room is only one small aspect of the world instead of vice versa. We tend to think of the process of teaching and learning as one where the teacher is just giving new information to the student, and the student then knows what they didn't know before. That's not really it. It's quite a bit more complex. The process of learning is one of noticing relations between the new thing and the old things you already know. We associate things with what's already there in our minds. So a good teacher doesn't simply tell you new information. They help you relate it to an existing matrix of knowledge you already have. Much of this process can be subconscious or implicit, but if you have kids in your life, for example, think about how you answer a child when they ask a question. What is a forest, they might say. You answer something like, you know the tree we have in our backyard, the big tall tree? Well, a forest is where lots and lots of those trees grow together. And they might come back and say, like, how many's a lot? Like 10 trees? Like 100 trees? And you'd say, well, no, actually it's a lot more than that. You know how when we're up on the hill and we look out over the city and you can see all the houses and buildings? Well, imagine if all those were trees, more than you can even count. Tons and tons of trees as far as you can see. That's how big a forest is. It's huge. And so by this process you would be building new knowledge for the child on top of their existing knowledge. And this process of learning by association is always happening, even with adults. The problem is, of course, you can learn wrongly. You can make incorrect or bad associations. You can cement these bad associations and confirm them for yourself over time. You can develop procedures and institutions and base an entire network of ideology or political and economic structure on these bad learned associations. You have a leader, for instance, who starts calling such and such an ethnic group bugs. Where there are a lot of bugs in our living space, what do you call that? Well, you call it an infestation. What do you do if you have an infestation? You call an exterminator. See where I'm going with this? This is an extreme example, but by slow moves, you can actually begin to legitimize just about anything you want to by making these associations in people's minds. Usually it's unconscious. Usually adults are too arrogant to think that they're being influenced and taught like this. But you can control an entire population and get it to do awful, awful things. Okay, so that's on the heavy side. In another anecdote from Dallas Willard, people are like a fighter pilot pulling several Gs whose perception is distorted by the acceleration and speed. The pilot then maneuvers to go into a steep climb high into the sky, but too late To his horror, he realizes that he'd been flying upside down, and he flies directly into the ground. People are darkened. Their perceptions are upside down. People don't just have the wrong facts or moral standards. Many times they even have the right facts and moral standards, but use them in the wrong way, or plant them in the wrong soil, if you will, nurturing them towards the wrong abiding hope. In the words of Flannery O'Connor, they're right, but they're not right enough. It's Jesus' task to tell people that what they thought was day is actually night. More than that, it's an entire society that thinks night is day and has developed elaborate doctrinal, ritual, religious, political, social, and economic structures based on the assumption that night is day, designed to protect the idea and label any who would dissent as subversive or heretical or unpatriotic. Read the Gospels to find the ways Jesus confronts this failure of perception in his hearers. The failure in their way of knowing God and nation and messiahship, and you start to see that Jesus is in fact, even at just the level of his teaching vocation, much more than just a pithy aphoristic teacher of good feelings and moral behaviors. He's effecting a revolution in a way of thinking. If you recall, Jesus declared in John's Gospel, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Or for our purposes, I am the way of knowing. I am the epistemology. He doesn't tell people they're wrong, per se. He tells them that their whole way of determining right from wrong is wrong. Take note that that passage is not a warning to the local relativist or atheist. It is a warning to his own disciples about making things other than himself central to the way decisions are made and priorities are set, how the entire God agenda or church agenda is to go forward. So a classic example of Jesus doing this is the phrase he frequently uses, "You have heard it said, ... but I say to you." Meaning the Old Testament or some rabbinic interpretation of it says A, but A is either wrong or inadequate. Instead, I give you B, this different truth. So replace A with B. On the surface, it sounds like Jesus is simply presenting new information. He's telling people, don't believe that, believe this. That's, of course, one thing that's happening, but what's really going on there is he's subverting the entire authority structure by which people come to believe things in the first place. Rabbinic practice was to associate what they were teaching with a prior teacher, or with the Bible itself. They would show how the thing they're teaching is an elaboration on something previously accepted by all, or by the hearer at least. How it depended on a prior authority for its trustworthiness. That presumes that they've all accepted a certain authority, and now they're having a discussion based on that authority. And you can maybe trace a chain of authority back to Moses and ultimately to God himself, Revelation. So this is how they showed their legitimacy to their audience. And you have heard it said, but I say to you, Jesus is completely subverting that authority structure. He's not just giving them new info, he's giving them a new authority to trust, one that doesn't depend on the previously existing matrix of authoritative knowledge. The unspoken statement by Jesus is that he has this unprecedented, unique right to depend on no other authority but his own word. And he'll quote the Bible all right, but he'll make it mean something that no one ever thought to make it mean, something that is entirely centered on his own person, his actions, his own priorities. That's not just a radical or arrogant thing to do, it's blasphemous if he doesn't have that authority. But the point is that Jesus' teaching is very often giving people more than just new knowledge or insight. He's giving them a whole new basis for receiving insight himself. He's claiming an unprecedented position for himself in the so-called matrix of knowledge. Now, when you learn something new, it has to be able to integrate with Jesus in order to be true. Not just the Bible, not just a tradition you like, not just a charismatic personality. A true insight has to be intelligible to Jesus as he is revealed by his witnesses. And that goes for everything, not just spiritual stuff, not just church-related stuff. Okay, so that's a lot of stage setting. Back to the Emmaus Road passage. For all these reasons, I don't think it's that unusual that Jesus isn't recognized by his disciples here, given the givens. After all, Jesus died. They are very upset. Their hopes have been shattered. They're certainly not expecting to see him after he's died. And one thing that has been shown again and again is that people see what they expect to see, because that is how their minds, even down to the physical makeup of their brains, have been formed. They don't simply see purely what is there. They make meaning out of what they see without being conscious of it. And the meaning-making process is not simply one of perceiving raw data, it's the mind's way of organizing data to come to a conclusion about what's happening, about what category to put it in. It's making sense of things. So the disciples do not see what they don't expect to see, namely Jesus raised from the dead, even though he's right there in front of them. It's not that they're stupid or weak-minded, it's that they're not capable. If you think of the neurological term synapses, the electrical impulses in our brains, these synaptic pathways have not been created yet to be able to recognize Jesus Christ as a risen human being. We can interpret the same basic sensory data in radically different ways depending on our context. Our expectations, our emotional state, maybe what we had for breakfast that morning, what somebody said earlier in the day, what epistemology has been established. The hardest hard sciences to come to any useful conclusion depend not on just raw, unmediated facts, but on people's interpretation of those facts, collating them, giving them meaning, presenting them for a certain purpose. What Jesus' disciples experienced in their unrecognition was because they had no expectation for a dead person to rise. No mental grid on which to map the idea of a walking, talking, human Jesus following his confirmed physical death. This tells me that we don't naturally see the meaning that we're supposed to see. It's a skill that is taught. Or maybe it's more like a disease that needs to be cured. It becomes apparent in this chapter that Jesus wants himself to become the basis for all human knowing. To see what is there, their entire ability to perceive must be renovated, renewed. They must be given access to a way of knowing, a new way of knowing. Until that happens, they will go on seeing what they expect. A fellow traveler, unknown to them, someone who incredibly isn't up to date on the current events, and who needs to be explained into a common sense understanding of what's going on in the world.